Hello and welcome to the Sound on Sound podcast about electronic music and all things synth. I'm Caro C and today I'm talking to the brilliant composer Nainita Desai. Nainita has written scores for many BAFTA, Emmy and Oscar award-winning and nominated films and TV series. Recent projects include the feature film American Murder, which is currently #1 around the world on Netflix. Nainita produced a 360-degree score for the feature The Reason I Jump, which won the World Cinema Documentary Audience Award at Sundance Film Festival 2020. Nainita's output varies greatly, from epic classical scores to moody electronica, and she's really passionate about her synths too. Hello Nainita, and thank you very much for joining us today, and welcome to this Sound on Sound podcast. It's lovely to speak to you. We met at Synth Fest last year and it was nice to talk all passionate electronic music and tech nerdities with you. So I think I'd be interested to start with what you're up to at the moment and what wonderful projects you have going on.
Hi, Cara. Thank you for inviting me onto your podcast. So what am I doing at the moment? I'm working on a variety of projects, all mainly film and TV based. I've got a feature film coming out early next year, which is based on a book called The Reason I Jump, which I'm very excited about. But I'm working on a few TV series for Netflix, which is really fascinating. It's a true crime project, and it's lots of twists and turns and weird, bizarre, unusual music. So I'm very excited about that. And I'm working on a documentary feature for HBO, which is about personality testing. And I'm excited about that musically because it's allowing me to come full circle to writing some electronica music and synthwave, which has been a real treat to get into because, you know, people like to stereotype you, think, well, you do this kind of music, you do that style of music. And I work for lots of different clients and I write in many different genres within the world of, under the umbrella of film and television. So between all my different types of clients, I cover a lot of different styles because, I might do natural history, which is big orchestral writing. And those kinds of clients think, oh, Nainita doesn't do synth wave and electronica. And then I'll do something else which pushes me in a different direction stylistically. So between all of them, I cover a lot of bases. And that's what I really love about what I'm doing at the moment, which I've got about 9 or 10 projects. And because they're also different stylistically, creatively, it keeps me fresh. There's nothing worse for me than regurgitating the same style of music from project to project because it just all blurs into one. And I know that, a lot of composers, specialize in one style, but I think one of my strengths is my diversity, which can be for the better or the worse. I think I like to keep myself interested in what I'm doing, and my part of my process is to jump from different styles.
Yeah, I can relate to the keeping yourself fresh in terms of you're always learning. If you had your signature sound, which we all have, there'll be some thread in what you're doing, yes, the essence of you. But there's something about that. Just this week, someone said, right, can you do me a podcast jingle? I want it in this. And it was just like, yes, it just throws that, freshness in. And you're like, right, okay, how am I going to respond to that? And I think if anything, it keeps the creativity alive, but also it keeps you stretched, I think.
Yes, it does. Yeah, it does. And for me, one of my mantras is that writing music for film and TV, it's a lifelong learning process. You never stop learning. On every project I'll treat myself to a new toy which I'll immerse myself into, or just a new process, because when I'm writing, for example, it's my default mode is to sit in front of the computer with my screens in front of me, my master keyboard, controller keyboard, and plugins and sample libraries. And that's which is great, but when you're doing that sort of 12 hours or 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, you can become stagnant. And I think it's really important to mix up one's creative process and to inject that sort of lifeblood into, I'll turn to a music. I mean, I'm a jack of all trades and a master of none. That's the way I see myself. So I've got a room full of musical instruments, acoustic instruments and electronic instruments, synths and so on, and various controllers, and will turn my hand to them to try and mix things up in the way that, I'm not a great guitarist, but the way I'll write on the guitar will be very different to the way I'll write on the keyboard, or I'll bring out one of my favorite toys at the moment is a halo. It's a kind of a hand pan, and I use it very sparingly. It was right for one particular project I did last year, and I started playing it, and it just injects a bit of, it just excites me and forces me to be creative and to write in a different way. Instead of sitting in front of the computer, which I must admit I do a lot of the time anyway. Mm-hmm. Or I'll bring in musicians. I'm very inspired by, bringing in collaborators and musicians to play as well, which is always very refreshing.
Yeah, and you talked about going full circle back to synthwave electronica. What's your electronica roots, if you like?
So I got into the industry via technology. I was always a bit of a geek. I loved computers. I think my first computer was an old Amstrad PC, and I was very much into video games as well. I had an Atari 2600, and so really into computers. I started off I had a 4-track Fostex X26 multi-track recorder, and I think it's still in my parents' attic. And and I built up my own home studio. So I had the Fostex X26, I had a Sony DAT recorder, TCD D3, I had a WMD6 sort of state-of-the-art cassette recorder for sort of location recordings. I was really into sound. At school, I was a performer, and I wanted to be a singer, and I was writing my own material on guitar and piano, and I learned the violin. But I also loved synthesizers, and I saved up. It took me, I think, a year and a half to save up to buy my first synth, which was a Roland D70. I wasn't going to compromise with the D50 as much as I loved it. I thought I'll go the full whack and get the I think it was 76 keys on the Roland D70, which I still have. I bought the Roland R8 drum machine, and what else did I have? I had a Access Virus B synth, the rack-mounted version, and a Yamaha TG77, the rack-mounted version of the DX7. And when I went to university and I did a degree in mathematics, and my thesis was on the wave equation. So, and it was all, and it was just sort of on the cusp of actually the DX7 had come out, but unbeknown to me, I was determined to create and invent my own form of sound synthesis. So I studied the wave equation and got into creating sounds, and I thought, here I've invented sound synthesis system, which was actually what the DX7 used, with sine waves and the wave equation and so on. I wasn't the first to get there, sadly, but it really opened up doors. I did a postgraduate course in music information technology, so I really studied psychoacoustics, music and emotion, music and streaming, Xenakis, the Greek mathematician who's really into architecture as well, and these great graphical drawings and how he constructed his music. And of course, my heroes, really as a teenager, my heroes were Jean-Michel Jarre, and my dream was to work for the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. And that's, the Delia Derbyshire and Elizabeth Parker, who worked at the tail end of the Radiophonic Workshop. So that was my dream job. I thought, I can earn a living out of this. It seemed like a sensible route. And then, of course, I couldn't do it. I couldn't apply because the radiophonic workshop closed down. And, of course, they no longer took on apprentices or trainee studio managers.
Yes. So, I mean, how did you know about people like, before the internet? How did you know about people like the radiophonic workshop? Because in a way, I gather that it was quite sort of a hidden kind of work, really, that was going on.
No, I mean, it was this hidden world, wasn't it? And it was almost pre-computers as well in many respects. So, I grew up loving the Doctor Who theme and Vangelis and Jean-Michel Jarre and all these artists, but with the radiophonic workshop, which was my ultimate dream, I have to admit, Caro, I owe a lot to Sound on Sound, because I would put all my pocket money into buying the monthly Sound on Sound magazine, and I would pore over every article and every word in all these amazing interviews and articles. And it was one of the very few leading resources in music technology at the time. I mean, yes, you had Mix Magazine, which was very US based, and I used to buy the occasional issue of that if I could afford it. But Sound on Sound was like my religious Bible, and still is. I think I must be one of their oldest subscribers for over 25 years now. So that's how I discovered the radiophonic workshop. And then I used to follow everything that they were doing. So that was my way into the industry, really.
Yeah.
And I was, at the same time, I was very much into sound, and not just music. So I got a scholarship to go to the National Film and Television School to study sound for film. And that gave me a great grounding in location sound recording, audio post-production. And while I was doing my postgrad diploma in music information technology, I did a paper in audio post-production practices within the film industry. So it was an excuse for me to go and visit all these amazing post-production facilities like Delane Lee in Soho, which is still one of the leading audio post facilities with great, Dolby dubbing theatres and sound editors working away on their digital sound systems. And I was sort of like an early digital baby. I got in when, even before Pro Tools had become widely used, I was using technology. I became an apprentice, an assistant sound designer on feature films, and I was working on the synclavier, which was just, to be able to get my hands on the synclavier, which cost about £250,000 at the time, and I think there are about only 5 or 6 of them in the UK, so they were like gold dust, and it was an amazing opportunity for me to get my hands on that kit. And at the time, the synclavier and the Fairlight were very much in vogue, and the Fairlight was really taken on board by people like Peter Gabriel and
Kate Bush used it a lot, didn't she?
Kate Bush and Trevor Horn, of course, Grace Jones, Slave to the Rhythm. And so I was blown away by that, the way that the sampler was being used at the time. What was it, 32 megabytes of RAM or whatever it was, which was so luxurious. And so I got to get my hands on that at work, and I'd use it and understand the technology. And at school, going back to my teenage years, my music department at school had an EMS VCS3. They'd spent a lot of money on it, and no one was using it. And so I said to the head of music, "Can I borrow this?" And and he said, "Yeah, sure, don't worry about it, take it home." So I took it home.
Was that the one in the briefcase?
Yes, the one in the briefcase, the one like Battleship. Yes. And I used to play around with the pins and make squeaks and squawks out of it. And so I took it home. I borrowed it for 2 years, and no one had noticed that it wasn't there in the music department.
Excellent. Well, it needed to be used. It needed the life and the love.
Of course it did. Someone had to use it. So when I left school, I took it back. Of course, I was honest. And I took took it back and they said, oh, we didn't realise this was missing, you know. I thought, damn, I could have kept it. And of course, now they're worth about 20k, or, you know, they're sort of vintage antique value.
Yeah. So we have with Delia Derbyshire Day with our educational work, we've got some licenses for the IVCS3. And I don't know if you had a play on that at all.
No, I haven't.
It's fun, and they've come up with loads of amazing presets in terms of really, I think it's a guy called Edward Cosby in particular that's been really making all these presets as a way in sort of thing. But yeah, it's quite good fun. It's even got the Every Nun Needs a Synthie with the endorsement of Peter Zinoviev as part of the app as well.
Yes.
I mean, obviously, you know, the I versions may not be the same, or the virtual versions may not be the same. I started off on a Korg Poly 800 and I did love it. It was sort of the bridge between analog and digital.
Yes.
But at the same time, I think I am quite in love with my Arturia, you know, my soft synths as well.
Well, I have an Arturia Matrix Brute, which is, you know, that crossover between the analog and digital, and that's huge fun. I really enjoy that. But at the time, so when I was working as a sound designer, I was working with the DAR sound station, which had a touch-sensitive screen, and it was very progressive and forward. It was at the cutting edge of technology. And there was another system made by SSL called the SSL Screen Sound. And it was a bit like a tablet, like a Wacom tablet with a pen, a stylus pen. Of course, we take it all for granted now with iPads and the Apple pens. But that was quite, you know, we had a multi-channel setup, and I could, I worked for a year in Germany. After I finished film school, I got offered a job as a sound designer, a sound editor at this post-production facility, which had just amazing gear. You know, they had a Neve VR Legend mixing desk, which I got to use. You know, the sort of the height of, I mean, it was just the best mixing desk in the world at that time, alongside the Euphonics, which was a different beast altogether. But I was using the SSL Screen Sound, and I was recording. I was a Foley artist.
I was going to ask if you got to do any Foley. Yes,
yeah.
Brilliant.
So I was doing Foleys, and then I'd have to be a Foley editor as well, and edit my own Foleys. So that taught me a lot about, you know, being on both sides of the studio, you know, being in the studio, recording the Foleys, you know, with, you know, crushing cabbages and putting and you know, footsteps and all of that, which I was really, you know, it taught me a lot about, you know, watching picture and anticipating body movements, and, you know, working with squeaky suitcase handles and all sorts of things.
Yeah. And mic placement.
Yes, yeah, and then editing it afterwards. And then I was also, you know, doing sound design. I managed to work with Werner Herzog, who's just such a amazing filmmaker and still is today. He's such a legend in the industry. So I did that, but then I missed London, and I came back after a year. I just thought, I can't live in Germany anymore. I love Germany, but I was missing the buzz of London. So I came back, and I was unemployed, and I didn't know what to do. And I was desperate. After a few years of working in film, as creative as it was, it wasn't my true passion was music, and I loved film and I loved music. And so I had met Peter Gabriel when I was at university, and he came to the university to meet the students, and I was showing him some work that I was doing at university, which was doing some hypercard MIDI programming on these little Mac SEs, these really old Macs, and I did some sort of in the early days of MIDI. I was writing a little software program to allow people to understand Indian classical rhythms, because I'd studied Indian classical music as a child, and you know, these different complicated cross rhythms. And so it was a little sort of tutorial program that demonstrated all these Indian classical rhythms. And he found that really interesting, and he said, look, Nainita, look me up when you finish university. And of course I didn't, because I'd gone into the film industry. But when I came back to London after my time in Germany, I remembered what he said, and he was a huge hero of mine, a musical hero, and what he was doing with world music and real world and WOMAD was just so inspiring. And I remember hearing the soundtrack to The Last Temptation of Christ, Passion, on the radio. And I thought, what is this sound? It's just incredible. And so what turned me into music was really, I wanted to be a music engineer and a music producer, or more an engineer, really. And so I wrote Peter a letter to Real World, a handwritten letter. And then 2 weeks later, I got a phone call from the studio manager. I said, Nainita, we've got your letter. Would you like to come and visit us? And, it was like going to Real World, this the big room and see the setup. So I went along for a meeting, and it ended up being a 4-hour meeting where I got a tour of the studio, had lunch there, talked to the studio manager. He introduced me to some of the engineers, and I came back to London just buzzing with inspiration. And then I got a phone call saying, would you like to be Peter's assistant engineer during the Real World Recording Week sessions?
Fantastic.
So that was 1992, 91, 92. And unbeknown to me at the time, it did feel like, it was a bit like going to Woodstock. It's one of these legendary moments in musical history where what Peter did was, it was a bit like a summer camp. He set up this environment over a summer where he invited 70 of the world's top world music artists and engineers and producers, and they set up about 7 or 8 recording studios that were operating round the clock, and all sorts of collaborations and sessions would go on where they'd put together a classical string quartet with a West African band, with a trip hop record producer, just to see what kind of music that I'd come up with, and people were writing tracks on the spot. And so I was in Peter's room, working with Dave Bottrell, he was Peter's main engineer at the time, and with Peter in the room, and we'd have there'd be recording sessions going on all day and all night. And so I got to work with Nigel Kennedy and Billy Cobham and Papa Wemba, this amazing West African band at the time, and Sinead O'Connor would come in to do backing vocals. And
amazing feast.
I remember there was one moment where it was 11 o'clock at night and I was working hard, and Daniel Lanois was in the big room, and he said, we're putting together a choir. I need some backing singers. So Peter said, oh, Nainita will go and do that for you. So I ended up being on the backing vocals on some tracks with Daniel Lanois, it was engineering. And so that was a really special moment. And now looking back on it, it's regarded as one of those special musical historical moments in recording.
I think there was the pioneering spirit. It was a time when it all felt like it was blossoming, and it felt like anything was possible. And I hope you felt that generally with technology. I think it does open up the possibilities more in terms of your palette, but also how you can touch certain, especially when it comes to film and stuff, but in terms of touching certain emotional frequencies, if you like.
Yeah, I think, you need that. You need time to find your voice and that time to experiment. And, and being at university is a great opportunity to do that. But I was a digital baby, and I came from a tech background, and that was my route and path into composing music, as opposed to scoring music the traditional way and going to music college and doing a degree at the Royal College or the Royal Academy. And really, the combination of my background in world music and just having that open mind to sound, as obviously sound, my background in sound design as well, just having that openness is so important to what I do today. Because music is, sounds are sounds, and, use all sorts of sounds to achieve the emotion and the storytelling that I'm trying to get across. Because what I do now, I see myself as a storyteller. Being a media composer these days means you have to have this really diverse and wide skill set of being able to program, mix, engineer, record, do everything, and compose everything yourself. But at the same time, just to inject fresh voices and fresh creativity, I think collaboration is also so important, and I love bringing in musicians into my work as well. So I'll be recording with the BBC Symphony Orchestra one day, to the London Contemporary Orchestra, to a small ensemble, to individual session musicians who will come to my studio, because, where I'm not a master of the violin. I'm not a violinist, and, I need to bring in those people and also sustain the industry and help, because writing music can be so isolating, and I am stuck in my studio at the bottom of my garden all day. And I like traveling, we need to be inspired. For me, it's with traveling and meeting other musicians from all over the world.
Yeah. Definitely. I think that that exchange, I'm really aware of that at the moment, in terms of that magic that happens by meeting other ears and minds and hearts.
It's funny, the one thing that I learned from working with Peter was his process, his ideology is that music, it's all about capturing the magic of performance. So he used to keep a tape running all the time, and that was one of my jobs, was that we had a DAT recorder running, recording everything that was going on in the room at the time during a session. So if Peter would stop, we'd do another take, or Peter would say, "That's a really good take," to such and such a musician. And I'd make a note. I had this big book where I'd write down everything that Peter said. And then 2 hours later, he could turn around to me and say, "Oh gosh, Nainita, there was this really amazing take that Nigel Kennedy did. What did I say?" And I'd have to have this sort of memory like a Rolodex, and I'd have this logbook, and I say, "I'll go back," and I'd make a note and a star next to 5 stars next to a point at 2:20 in the afternoon where Peter said, "That was a really great take," and I'd rewind the DAT to that point and play it back to Peter and the musicians. And then they go, "Oh yeah, that was a really one," because there was so much improvising going on. It was very much based on improvisation. So I'd play that back, and he'd go, "Yeah, that's that moment. I really love that little phrase there." And so you can see why it takes Peter so many years to write an album, because he's just an ideas man and surrounds himself with a really great team that can support that unique way of working. Of course, that was before digital, that before computers were really being used. Of course, he used the Fairlight, but it was a musical synthesis way, whereas we weren't really using computers in the way that we use now. I was the computer. I was just going to say that. That's totally what I'm imagining. I'm imagining this young, clever lass who's really keen, like your eyes are in Alice in Wonderland, and basically you are his computer, where always tape machine, where he's going, "I just want to go back to that. Can we rewind to that bit?" And you know exactly which bit. You were his voice-activated computer. Yes. Yeah. Excellent. And in terms of, is there any kit that you had back then that you still hold near and dear? Well, I sold off. The one piece of kit I regret selling actually is the Yamaha TG77. I had it for one sound. At the end, I just kept it for one sound, and so I missed that sound. But I still have my Roland D70, which I love to bits. I still have my Roland. I'm a big Roland fan, it turns out. I had the Roland S70 760 sampler, which I used on a feature film, a science fiction feature film, to do all the sound design on that. I had a lot of monster creature effects, which I sampled into that, and I used to make up my own sounds. And I love my D70, and I had the Roland 5080 with all the expansion cards. So that served me well in the first 6 or 7 years of being a film and TV composer. I really relied on that. And I had the Opcode Studio Vision. That was my first DAW system that I used, with the Opcode MIDI interfaces. So I had things like the EMU Proteus modules and the Yamaha synths. So I was using a lot of hardware synths, and I had a Yamaha SPX90 and a Alesis Quadraverb, which is really special, lovely reverb actually. But my setup now is I've been buying a lot of hardware since. I minimized my setup to just be working really in the box with loads of plugins and sound libraries. My first plugin I ever bought was the GRM Tools plugins, and they no longer worked. They sort of stopped making them. I think something happened to the company, and I upgraded my system and it just no longer worked. And then only last year or a couple of years ago, I discovered that some French company had taken over the company and they'd reissued them. And so I rebought all the GRM Tools plugins, which were fantastic in terms of, I love using granular synthesis, and there's a freeze plugin that they use. And so I like manipulating the human voice with those plugins. So I use those, which just happens to be the first plugins I ever bought about 20 years ago.
Yeah, and nice to have that familiarity, I guess, even though there's obviously lots of newness in there.
Yes, yeah. And so my studio's been growing a lot over the last couple of years. I've got an API lunchbox with I just have a really nice clean signal path. U87 is my main mic, and I've got a couple of Neumann TLM 193s and some KM 184s for plucked stringed instruments, which has a lovely brightness to them.
Right.
And I've got I've also recently bought the Universal Audio. There's a digital modeling microphone that they have.
All right.
Because I've got the Universal Audio Apollo interfaces. So I'm a big user of all their analog emulations, all their plugins. So in terms of mastering, my mastering bus, I'll use the Pultec EQs and multiband compressors if I'm working on a feature or, something. I use Ozone as well. Isotope Ozone is useful.
Yeah.
For mastering.
So you do your own mastering as well then?
Well...
Or you are a mastering engineer as well?
No, that I'm not.
Same here. I do mastering, but I would never call myself a mastering engineer.
No, if I'm doing an album or something, I do have a Shadow Hills Jill Van der Graaf in API lunchbox form, and that has this lovely dark gritty texture to it, which is good for certain types of soundtracks. And if I'm doing a dark soundtrack, or rather dark music in terms of emotionally dark music, then that does come in quite useful. It just gives the music such a character. It has its own character, but I wouldn't use it ordinarily. Depends on the color and the emotion that I'm after, really. But yeah, Neve preamps, 1073 preamps in API lunchbox with the Neumann U87, and that goes into my computer via the Universal Audio Apollos.
Sounds like a very nice setup.
Yeah, I've got a lot of guitar pedals, which go into my synths. I've got Juno 60 and what else have I got? Arturia Matrix Brute, the Prophet 6, Moog Voyager. So, I'm very much, away from the software and the plugins. I think it's important for me to be tactile and have that human connection with instruments and hardware, because it just forces me to write in a different way. And that's very much, using different types of controllers. Like, I'm a big advocate of Roly. I love the Roly C boards and the rises. I was one of the first person in the country to have, in the UK, to have the big Roly Grand Stage 88 key keyboard.
It says it gives a fresh approach. How would you say it does that?
Yeah, for me, with technology, it's always been about, going back to Peter's ideology about capturing the magic of performance. And for me, it's about, doing that, but also breaking down the barriers of technology and getting your ideas down. So, like, for example, a violinist, they can do vibrato and with pressure and velocity and get all their dynamics out. But when you're playing a keyboard, which is my default instrument, getting expression into performance is harder because I'm having to record the musical part on the keyboard into my Logic Pro, and then I have to artificially program in the expression and the dynamics and the CC controller information. And by the time that's all been done, I've forgotten my idea. I want to break down that barrier of what's in my mind when I'm inspired, and I want to get an idea down as quickly as possible, quickly down in Logic so that it sounds good as it can, very, very fast.
Capturing the magic.
Yeah, because otherwise that magic of inspiration, creative inspiration, is gone if I'm having to think about it too much. And technology there is that problem with technology because we have so many options, that we can do so much that you get bogged down in the details and you lose that magic of inspiration. So something like the Roley, which is, the velocity aftertouch and the MPE capabilities of it mean that I can inject that expression into a performance when I'm playing the keyboard that a violinist can or a guitarist can, with vibrato and bending the notes and that all those different aspects of musical performance. So I love it, and I'm always playing around with new ways of doing that, like the Jouet Play. That's another little. It's a French company. The French are really great at coming up with wacky controllers. I've got the Lie Touché, which works really well with the Arturio Matrix Brute. So I've got that that sits next to me, next to my controller keyboards. I love the touch strips on the. I've got the Native Instruments sort of Mark II S25 keyboard. For key switches, but I also use the touch strips on it as well. And there's another one, it's a Palette Gear. So Palette Gear have come up with these little portable modules. It's modular blocks, and you can assign CCs to these little modular blocks of faders or little knobs. And they're really... It's great for a portable setup on my laptop, on my MacBook Pro, but it's so easy to use in terms of assigning CC controllers. So I really like that as well. And I'm really looking forward to the new Osmos controller keyboard, which is a development of the Haken technology, the Haken keyboard. It was competing with the Roley C boards, but I've got the little Roley Rise keyboard as well, and I think they're really great because it's all about making technology accessible to everyone at a lower price bracket. But I use it as an additional sort of keyboard alongside my cheap Akai MPK88 controller keyboard.
Any dreams or hopes for the future of technology within music?
Well, there's the whole thing about AI, isn't there? I think in terms of speeding up workflows and breaking down the barriers that technology can pose, I'm always interested in new technologies and using them, but they are just a tool. Really for me, the most important thing are the ideas. As much as, what's funny is that as much as, I use sound libraries all the time and I look for the imperfections in things. I think that with the advent of digital technology, digital synths, from the analog, there's this big surge in going back to the old analog because of the warmth and the humanity that it brings into music. I've noticed the way I write and what I look for when I'm working with bringing musicians is that I look for sound libraries that have imperfections. And so I'm interested in the boutique sound libraries. Yes, I use all the Spitfire, which are my default libraries that I use, and Orchestral Tools and 8Dio and Sound Iron and all of those big established library companies, but also working with real musicians, so that I'll do recording. I'll have experimental recording sessions, and then out of that I'll create my own little sound libraries, my own contact patches and contact libraries that give me that individuality, for every project that I'm working on. So, for instance, I've got a new Netflix film coming out at the end of this month, end of September. It's called American Murder. And it's a true crime film. It's about a remarkable murder, about a man who murdered his wife and two young children in cold blood, and fairly recently in America. And I can't say much about it, but I can say that the whole film is based on social media and text messages and Facebook and Twitter. And so the mobile phone plays a big part in how this story is told. So my unique way into the film was, okay, I'm going to record put the phone tapping on the mobile phone. And I did a recording session with this great percussionist who recorded himself doing little rhythms with his fingers tapping on the plastic. And out of that, I created some really tense rhythms of the fingers hitting the plastic. And there are some in the film, you see these big oil drums that are absolutely huge. So I took some of the location sound recordings of these oil drums and twisted them and distorted them and used them as part of the rhythms and the soundscape. My latest film, which is called The Reason I Jump, I did a lot of experimental recording with. It was a high concept score.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, because I work a lot with the work I do with Drake Music is working with disabled people. Plus, I've read that book. It was actually working with the facilitator, John Haynes.
Yeah.
So you need to read this book.
It's amazing.
And I think to support that would be, the very sort of a special sensitivity in a sense.
Yes. Well, in terms of the sounds that I used and my sound palette and the emotional side of the getting across the emotions in the story, you have 5 characters and they're all non-verbal. They don't speak. And so I wanted to give them a voice. So I used the human voice in the score, but the original book upon which the film is based, The Reason I Jump, is written by a 13-year-old Japanese boy, and he wrote the book in Japanese and then it got translated into English. So I took the original Japanese phrases, and they're very sort of existential, metaphysical, beautiful, almost very elegant and simple and beautiful in the way it's written. And there are some phrases, for example, like, we are outside the flow of time, because neurodiverse people, from his experience, is that his perception of time is different. So I took phrases like that and I broke them. It was like a broken jigsaw puzzle that you had to piece together. And so I recorded these vowels and consonants of these words, we are outside the flow of time, and broke them down into their elements, and then recorded it and then pieced it together. And I used a lot of granular synthesis and treatments and also GRM tools and all sorts of interesting treatments to sort of make it sound, taking organic sound sources and not making them sound electronic, but sort of twisting them and distorting them, and taking all these elements, aspects of autism, and translating it into music. So autistic people, they respond to repetition a lot. And so I brought in those repetitive movements in the music as well. And so it's all about the storytelling and trying to translate and get across the emotions in the film, whether you're portraying different characters and their personalities and themes, and translating that into a sound palette and into a a musical concept for the score that affects the viewer in a very subliminal way without them realizing that how everything is connected. And that's what I love about filmmaking and scoring music for film. Yeah, so using technology in an organic way, that sort of interests me.
Yeah, and like you say, keeping that humanity at the core.
Absolutely, yeah. I think at the core of it, because what do people respond to? When you watch a movie or a TV program or you're listening to music, ultimately, for me anyway, it's about how it makes me feel. And I love the ability to be able to make people feel something, whether it's fear or joy, when they're watching and experiencing a piece of art or watching a film. That it's about, in the nicest possible way, manipulating people emotionally and making them feel something. And that I never lose sight of that. So, emotions and storytelling and humanity is at the core of everything I do, even though I'm surrounded by technology, and I embrace it and use it for its strengths and what it's best at, as opposed to letting the technology be there for the sake of the technology.
Wow, fascinating stuff. And I feel like it's just still the beginning for you by the sounds of things. It sounds like it's an ever-expansive journey.
It is, yeah. I never know what I never know what I'm going to be doing from one day to 1 week to the next. So so yeah, it's all very exciting. Still excited after all these years.
Good, fantastic. And thank you for being being able to articulate all that. And over the years, you're up there with the pioneers that have seen through a lot of changes and still, as you say, still keeping it new.
Thank you, Cara. It's been an absolute delight talking to you today. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening, and be sure to check out the show notes for further information, as well as links and details to other episodes in the electronic music series. And just before you go, let me point you to soundonsound.com/podcasts, where you can explore what's on our other channels too. This has been a Caro C production for Sound on Sound.